So welcome, welcome again, those of you who've been here for the first session. Oh, I should take my mask off. Welcome to those of you who are joining us over Zoom as well. I'm very pleased to see a good turnout on a Friday morning in person. It is really just, I have to say, it is really very nice to have a meeting of enthusiasts and supporters of this kind of work in person. It's been a tough couple years, and this is already restorative. So thank you for those of you who are attending in person, and thank you to those who are able to join us over Zoom. For our second, I should say, I'm Benjamin Paloff. I'm the director of the Center for Russian East European Studies here at the University of Michigan. I apologize to those of you who are in the audience in person because you're going to hear me say that throughout the day. Welcome to our second panel for Building Bridges Over Walls, translation networks in the Upper Midwest. This event is co-sponsored by the Center for Russian East European Studies, Center for Russian East European and Eurasian Studies, as well as the Department of Comparative Literature at the University of Michigan. Our second panel is a presentation by a number of graduate students, not all of our graduate students who were involved in this project, but those who were able to attend today for these presentations. What we're going to do is go over a visual exhibit, a slideshow that we put together over the last several weeks. You can find this slideshow through the website of the Department of Comparative Literature. If you scroll down on the front page of that site, you'll get to the page for the Mellon Sawyer seminars, and from there you can select this seminar, and there's a slideshow in that, and we'll be sharing some of the materials from that slideshow in the next 45 minutes or so. I did want to mention a couple of personal highlights that I happen to have physical copies of, and those of you who are here in person can inspect physical copies at your leisure. They're out on the table in front of the meeting room. The first one I happen to have with me is the book I mentioned an hour ago in my introduction, Marina Tsvetaeva's A Captive Spirit Selected Prose, which is one of the very first books of Russian literature I ever purchased as a teenager. And I know that the section that I find that I've returned to most is Tsvetaeva's phenomenal essay, My Pushkin. And I know that because it's disintegrating right where that particular essay is, but this book was the first time I heard of Artist Publishers at 2901 Heatherway, Ann Arbor, as well as the first time I heard of Ann Arbor. Artist Publishers, as I mentioned before, was started by Carl and Ellen Day Proffer in 1971 at the University of Michigan, and I happen to also have with me the very first thing they published, which was a facsimile edition of Asip Mandelstam's 1921 poetry collection, Tristia, a pocket-sized edition that is exactly as it was originally published in Russia, with the one exception of saying on the copyright page, facsimile edition by Artist, Ann Arbor, 1972. And one other item I have with me, this is also, both of these items are in the visual slideshow that we'll be sharing, is also the same author, the poet Asip Mandelstam, who died in a Soviet transit camp in the late 1930s. His last collection of poems, the Voronezh notebooks, was banned in the Soviet Union, could not be published, certainly not in the book form that Mandelstam himself had conceived of it. So it was first published in that form, the form that the poet had imagined, in 1980, here in Ann Arbor, in Russian, in a tamizdat edition. And I'm holding this up because it is not this particular copy, but this edition is meaningful because we would not know Osip Mandelstam as a poet, a major world poet, the way we do today, if not for the efforts of his widow, Nadezhda, who never got to hold a copy of her late husband's book, the Voronezh Notebooks, until this edition, published in Ann Arbor, was handed to her by Karl and Elendea Proffer during one of their visits to the Soviet Union. So this is part of what we are celebrating. I'm just going to briefly mention the speakers who will be joining us. I will almost certainly get the order of speakers wrong, but just please bear with me. Our first speaker is going to be Samantha Farmer, who's a PhD student in Slavic languages and literatures at the University of Michigan and holds an MA in Russian, East European, and Eurasian studies from the University of Texas, where they also earned a BA in the same field and in history. Their research interests include Yugoslav, East European, and Mediterranean film and literature, the intersection of queerness, anti-fascist history and geography, and post-Cold War culture, and critical pedagogy. And their own translations from Serbo-Croatian to English can be found in Troika, Asymptote, and Zenithism, a Yugoslav avant-garde anthology, which is forthcoming in 2022 from Academic Studies Press. Our second speaker is, I believe, is Tanya Silverman, who's a graduate student in Slavic languages and literatures at the University of Michigan. Her research focuses on Czech film and the impacts of Central European literature on cultural products and perspectives. She earned a master's degree in Central European Comparative Studies from Charles University in Prague in 2018, and for her master's thesis explored the filmographies of 4 Czech New Wave directors by tracking their career developments after the end of the 1960s Czech New Wave movement. She's written articles about numerous topics, including art history, photography, and translation. Then third speaker will be Katie Kasparian, who is a PhD student in the Slavic department with a special focus on 20th century and contemporary literature from Russia and the former Yugoslavia. You are already hearing a bit of the range of literatures that are, and comparative approaches that our graduate students are taking. Katie is interested in how literature from this period retells history and memory, as well as in how literature contributes to dismantling state narratives. She was drawn to this project because of her engagement with museums, archives, and exhibitions of history. And having been born and bred in the Midwest, she is also thrilled to bring attention to the importance of the region and is indebted to many of the publishing houses for publishing many of her favorite texts. For this exhibition, she was primarily focused on Dalkey Archive Press and the European Classics collection from Northwestern University Press. Then we will hear from, is Ajar or Dylan going next? I think Dylan. Yes, Dylan. Ogden is a doctoral candidate in comparative literature at the University of Michigan, and his research uses theories of intertextuality and reader response to analyze historical interrelations between French and Russian literary cultures in the latter half of the 20th century, with a particular focus on the French Nouveau Roman and its late Soviet postmodern epigons in Russian literature. And finally, Ajar Dusakenova is a doctoral student in the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures, and her research is centered around contemporary transnational Russophone poetry with a particular focus on language and coloniality, gender and sexuality, translation, and the visual arts. So I will be controlling the slideshow from my laptop in the front row, but we will also have some additional slides controlled from here. And could we then have our panel, maybe you guys are welcome to either sit here or use the podium, whichever you prefer. And I will leave it that.
Good morning, everyone. So I looked through Slavica Publishers, which is now affiliated with Indiana University, but it started as an independent publisher in 1966, and it became affiliated with Indiana in 1996. And in this project, the first interesting, it's okay. First interesting novel I found was entitled Josef Mak, and it is a Slovak interwar novel that offers a glimpse into the ordinary of Slovak village life. And the novel actually follows the events of its eponymous protagonist, Josef Mak, whose name carries overt connotations of the ordinary. So the word mak, if you're not aware, means poppy seed in Slovak, Czech, and other Slavic languages, and represents something that is common and ubiquitous. And Hronsky in this novel does not idealize village life, but rather focuses on aspects of toil and hardship. Slavica Publishers published this first English language translation of Josef Mak in 1985 as part of an effort to make more works of Slovak literature and language available in English. The original Slovak version of the novel by Hronsky was published in 1933, before Hronsky emigrated from Slovakia in 1945. The translator, Andrew Chinchura, was good friends with Hronsky in Europe before Hronsky emigrated to Argentina, where he died in 1960. Chinchura had also done prior work with Slovak translations, such as assembling an anthology of Slovak literature in the 1970s. Slavica has also continued with Slovak literature enterprises such as Into the Spotlight, an anthology of contemporary Slovak literature that Slavica published in 2017. And then the next title I found is called Dress Rehearsal by Alexander Galich, and that was a pen name for Alexander Arkadovich Ginsburg. Galich was a poet and prose writer, screenwriter, playwright, and musician who played guitar in stage performances throughout the 1960s in the Soviet Union. He's most known for his poem songs that were distributed in a format known as magtizadat, a term for self-published tape recordings made using recording technology that had been widely available at the time. Galich wrote Dress Rehearsal in 1973, a year before he was forced to leave the Soviet Union, and 4 years before he died in Paris. So Dress Rehearsal is a prose work of 5 chapters, and also incorporated into this book are 4 acts of his band play, Sailor's Rest. The play focuses on complexities of Russian Jewish identities and also how Soviet identities play into that. So Slavica published this first English translation of Dress Rehearsal, translated by Maria Bolstein in 2008. And for the translation, Bolstein mostly relied on the text published by Posev Press in 1974, as well as several versions of Sailor's Rest published in Russia after '91. And then the last interesting piece I'll talk about that I found by Slavica is called Up the Devil's Back, which is a bilingual anthology of Czech poetry edited and translated by Bronislava Volkova and Clarice Koltier. Slavica published Up the Devil's Back in 2008, and the collection features 168 poems by 65 poets, printed in both Czech and English, as well as short biographies and even graphic portraits of the poets. The collection is pretty broad, and it aims to give an overview of the evolution of Czech poetry from the late 19th century to the early 21st century. It features well-known poets such as Jaroslav Seifert, who's so far the only Czech writer to have won a Nobel Prize in Literature. And the first half of the collection is organized according to movement and style, such as poetism and surrealism, whereas the latter half is organized into social conditions. And the section Masters of Irony and Futility, which is in the second half of the collection, features poets who lived in marginal circumstances and published their works in samizdat format or abroad in the 70s and 80s, such as Egon Bundy, whose grotesque poems were adapted into songs by the Plastic People of the Universe, who's a famous Czech underground rock band. And then there are also sections of Czech poetry in exile in other parts of Europe and North America. So thank you.
Okay, hello. My name is Samantha Farmer. I have too many slides and we're not going to get through all of them because this is a Herculean task. But I'm mostly going to talk about vaguely literature from the former Yugoslavia, particularly through Northwestern University Press's series, Writings from an Unbound Europe, one of whose editors is actually with us today, Clare Cavanagh. The general editor was Andrew Wachtel, and we also have another translator of BCS literature among numerous other languages. On the editorial board, Michael Henry Heim. So it's not a surprise that Yugoslav literature is so well represented, I think. And that series ran from 1993 until 2012, capping out at 61 titles. And I'll be mentioning some Dalkey titles. I know that Katie's going to be talking about Dalkey more, but something that you see in these runs is in the 90s, you do have kind of consolidation of canonical Yugoslav texts, I think, in canonical Yugoslav literature, if we're thinking about socialist literature really only being a 50-year formal period, but you kind of see reprints and new translations of really some of the largest names, among them a reprint of Miroslav Krleža's The Return of Filip Latinović in Zohar Dipolo's translation. And you also have the first translation into English of Mesha Selimović's novel, Death and the Dervish, which is the best-selling book in the entire Writings from an Unbound Europe series during its run. Does anyone in the physical room want to guess how many copies it sold?
More than mine.
Yes, Dr. Palef also translated in the series. It sold 6,000 copies, so if that gives you a scale for how many people buy translated literature in the US. But we also have another novel by Selimović translated through, or published through this series. But you also have other names that are not in the exhibit or these slides, like Bora Ćosić and Borislav Pekic, who are consistently published throughout the run. But another big name who died right before the end of real socialism in Eastern Europe, whose career we've kind of witnessed form in English translation, is Denny Lokish. On the next slide, do I have control over that? Okay. So these two on the left were reprints that were published earlier, but Northwestern European Classic Series published them, Hourglass and Encyclopedia of the Dead, the latter of which was translated by Michael Henry Heim. And in the 2000s, you see Dalkey kind of lean into getting things reprinted and also getting the untranslated works into English. So you have reprints of Tomb for Boris Davidovich and Garden Ashes with a preface by Alexander Himen. But in 2012, roughly, John K. Cox publishes early works and works that were unpublished at the time of Quiche's death. So Psalm 44, The Attic, and The Lute and the Scars. So it's really interesting to kind of see Quiche's English canon really get developed in this period after 1989. But I'm just going to highlight two other authors whose post-1989 careers in English translation were really, they gained a foothold in English through Northwestern University Press. And the first, I have no idea how to control this. The first of those is Dubaf Ugrashic, who is probably the most well-known post-Yugoslav writer, I would say. And she was also a fellow at the International Writing Program in Iowa in 1983. And Northwestern published two of her books, a collection of stories in the jaws of life, and the novel, Fording the Stream of Consciousness, which won her the 1988 Nien Prize for the best novel in Yugoslavia, and also the first woman to win it. And you can see here this really lovely photo of Michael Henry Heim taken by Ugrashic that is included in the kind of celebration of Henry Heim's translation work and mentorship called The Man in Between something. It came out from Open Letter in the past few years. But you also see Dalkey publish 2 of her books above. But after this, she does switch to Open Letter primarily for her North American English translations. Probably in no small part due to the fact that former Dalkey employee Chad Post founded Open Letter in Rochester after leaving Dalkey. So that continuity from the Midwest really does continue through the curation of publishers and translators, including Ellen Elias Bursac, who's on the left in this photo. She's also a really frequent collaborator of the second writer who gained a foothold through Northwestern in the 90s, and that's David El-Bahari, who was also a fellow at Iowa a few years after Ugrashic. He got 3 of his translations in Writings from an Unbound Europe in the late 90s and 2001, one of which was in his own translation into English. You don't see many self-translations. Nowadays, publishers don't trust him, I don't think, but it's a good translation. And you also have his collection Learning Cyrillic from Dalkey from the past 10 years or so. And I think just want to mention one more writer who is, I think, a new generation of post-Yugoslav writers, and that's Rumena Bujarovska. She's from Macedonia, and she's a short story writer primarily. And Paul Filev's translation of her collection, My Husband, came out from Dalkey just 2 years ago, and it really is one of the best books I've read. I think that she's such a stellar short story writer, which is evidenced by the fact that she's also a scholar of American short stories, and it's visible. So I guess I'll just close by mentioning a Michigan connection, and that is that 2 alumni of Michigan Slavic have had a hand in translating Dubaf Ugrashic. Vlad Baronia, who I had the pleasure of working with as a professor and advisor at Texas, translated Ugrashic's essay Red School, and I just got it in the mail this week because it was published by Megan Forbes' press, Harlequin Creature, who is also a PhD in the Slavic department. So it's not in the slide exhibit because it just came. But it's nice to see the tradition of Michigan Slavic translating continue.
All right. Hi, everyone. As Professor Palef has already mentioned, I primarily looked at Northwestern University Press's European Classics collection, as well as Dalkey Archive Press. And I think I'd like to start by talking about Northwestern University Press. Interestingly, it was first founded in 1893, which is crazy old. And it was originally a publisher of legal texts. And then in 1957, the press was established as a separate university publishing company, and it is there that we start seeing the European Classics collection and more literary texts being published. And Northwestern University Press has published many of my favorite books. Sam has already talked about many. The Unbound collection is incredible. But for Russian literature, it has published a lot of really interesting early Soviet texts, as well as some dissident literature that you don't really see published into English and aren't really taught in English language Slavic classes, I think. Interestingly, one of the first texts of early socialist literature that I read was Fyodor Gladkov's Cement. And you see Northwestern University Press kind of being one of the first reprints of this text since I do believe the 1930s when it was first translated. And it is actually the text that I myself read. And you also see, pulling up my notes on my phone, I didn't include this in the slides, but you also see republishing of Time Forward by Valentin Kitaev. And this was really interesting. I am really interested in art history as well. The cover of that is Kazimierz Malejevich's The Knife Grinder, and so it's just kind of beautiful connection between early Soviet prose and kind of futurism, expressionism. You also have one of the most interesting texts, I think, that you see is going to be The Town of N by Leonid Debichin. And this is going to be the first translation of this text into English. And if you don't know the history of the town of N, it was pretty much forgotten for a lot of the Soviet years due to harsh censorship following its publishing. Historically speaking, it's not confirmed, but it is thought that kind of the blowback that Debichin received from this text leads to his disappearance and subsequent suicide. And in 1998, we get an English translation by none other than Northwestern University Press. One other really interesting text that I found as I was scrolling around was Yuri Trifonov's The Disappearance. And this is going to be the last of his major works. And it was only first published in 1987 due to its writings on Trifonov's own experience with his friends and family, experiencing disappearances during the Great Purges. And Northwestern University Press, again, is the first to publish this novella into English in 1997, as well as his other stories, Encounters with Lise. And you see a lot of kind of these very important but lesser known to the English-speaking audience translations occurring under the European Classics collection. Also for this, I was looking at Dalkey Archive Press. I spent many years of my life in Chicago, and I was very interested in an interview with the founder of Dalkey. The idea originally came from a conversation in O'Hare Airport with one of his friends in 1980. Fascinating. Thank you to America's busiest airport for bringing Dalkey Archive Press to us. But Dalkey Archive Press, as I was kind of going through it, there's a lot of missing publishing history, but if you're interested, Columbia University and their archive collection has primarily from 1990 to, I want to say 2011, all of the books that they published. You can see lists if you're curious to see what else. It is an incredibly long list. The archive for Dalkey is so big that it is split between Stanford University and another university. Why Columbia has, I don't think that it's also housed at Columbia. Why Columbia has it, I'm not sure, but if you're curious, you can look there. But as Sam already mentioned, Learning Cyrillic was published. They have a focus on, as the founder says, subversive texts as well as experimental texts. And one of my favorite Yugoslav authors from former Yugoslavia is Svetislav Basara. And you have texts such as his first, The Chinese Letter. It is his first novel published, and it really kind of anticipates a lot of his later very experimental, very interesting work. And you also have texts from, this one was very interesting. In recent years, they've kind of been pushing towards getting Slovenian literature published, and so you have The Master of Insomnia, Selected Poems by Boris Novak. This was first published by him in 1995, and the 2012 collection includes poems never before translated into English. This is really interesting. I've not read this, but I'm very excited to, because you don't really see a lot of Slovenian literature published. And finally, we've got also kind of showcasing the really a push towards including this kind of experimental, just incredibly interesting literature. You have Leningrad by Igor Vishnevitsky. And this is a really contemporary avant-garde novel which depicts the siege of Leningrad. It includes excerpts from letters. It includes diary excerpts, newspaper excerpts. And of course, it was first translated into English and published through Dalkey Archive Press. So that is just kind of a very, very short history of these huge publishing houses. And I encourage you to really look into the history. Northwestern University's European Classics, most of them are on their website, but again, Columbia University, if you're curious. You can really see kind of the powerhouse that Dalkey Archive Press has been into getting prints reprinted as well as translated. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Ajar and I study contemporary Russophone literature, mostly outside of Russia. So this is why I was specifically looking for Russophone non-Russian writers. And today I'll be talking about these three very interesting, exciting texts that were published in Artis, and thanks to that got their international recognition in literary scholarship. So the first text is Fazel Iskander's Sandra из Чегема. And Fazel Iskander was an Abkhazian writer, Soviet writer, who saw a lot of recognition from the state. He was nominated for the Nobel Prize in Literature, at least proposed to be nominated by the Russian literary community twice, first by the Writers' Union, then by Russia's Pen Society. But before Sandra from Chegem, and the Russian version is, of course, Sandra из Чегема, Iskander was known mostly for his children's stories. And the book, when it saw its first publication in the Soviet Union, was cut almost in half. And it saw its first fuller, uncensored publication in Artis. And while looking for the history of this fascinating story of this publication, I stumbled upon an interview with Elendea Proffer, who herself told about the destiny of this book. And she said that it was brought by a Russian diplomat to America. And because they didn't want to compromise Iskander's state-favored career in the Soviet Union, they had to hide the contract and basically claimed that he never agreed to publish the book, the manuscript, because he was still writing this fascinating cycle. And when she was visiting a book fair in Russia, she was questioned by the KGB, and eventually the Copyright Association in the Soviet Union accused artists for publishing Russian writers without their consent. But luckily, the book was not just published in its fuller version that was uncensored, but also translated. And this is where the history of Sandra from Chegem began. Elendea Proffer says that the book was cut even more than Master and Margarita, Bulgakov's Master and Margarita, which is fascinating. And this publication has changed everything for Iskander's recognition in the West. And later, the full version, the final version, 30 years later after the first attempt to finish this text, Sandra from Chegem was published in Russia. And about the book itself, it's a cycle of epic/folk picaresque stories set in Abkhazia, starting from the 1900s to the 1960s. So it's a fascinating text. My next author is Gaito Gazdanov, who was a Russophone emigre writer. He was born into an Ossetian, Ossetinskaya family in St. Petersburg, and he spent his childhood in Ukraine and Siberia. He joined the White Army and moved to Paris quite early, so he was never published in the Soviet Union. And his first novel, Вечер у Clare, An Evening at Clare's, was very well received by Russian literary critics, and he was compared to Vladimir Nabokov and called to be one of the most talented writers, Russophone writers, producing their work outside of Russia. But this all happened in 1929, and unfortunately Gazdanov's name went into oblivion for some period, and 50 years later he was published in Artis. The book was also translated by Jody Daynard in 1988. And Gazdanov's work saw its recognition in the West. And fascinatingly enough, his work reached Russia only in the 1990s, when in 1998, a Society of Gazdanov's Friends was formed. So his literary oeuvre is still very much unstudied. And my final author is Bakit Kingshiev, who is a Russophone poet of Kazakh descent. He was born in modern-day Shymkent in Kazakhstan and grew up in Moscow, spent most of his life there, was very much involved, and is still very much involved with the literary community there. He was one of the co-founders of a samizdat literary group called Moskovskoye Vremya, the Moscow Time, and along with Saprovsky, Alexei Tsvetkov, Sergei Gandlevsky, they were running an almanac in Moscow in 1970s. Although his works, his poems, individual poems were published, not just in this almanac, but also generally in samizdat in Russia at that time, his very first complete book of poetry saw light in Ardis when he was invited in 1984 to Ann Arbor. And once again, thanks to that publication, Kingshiev gained his international recognition and has been pretty well studied since then. Thank you.
Right. Hello, everybody. My name is Dylan, and like Ajar, I was also doing a lot of work with the artists collection, which meant I was completely spoiled for choice. And so this is just a selection of a few titles that appealed to my idiosyncratic tastes. And as I was thinking about notable titles worth bringing up in this regard, one of the first that came to mind was Sasha Sokolov's School for Fools, Shkola для Durakov in Russian, which I think is a really heartening success story of what international publication and translation of Slavic literatures can look like. Sokolov, prior to this, his first novel, he was a journalist. He had published a few short stories, but to a broad audience, he was more or less invisible to most. He had heard about artists through word of mouth of other Russian authors, and decided to send the manuscript for School of Fools to artists. And the novel itself incorporates many elements of modern aesthetics in broad strokes. You have playing with stream of consciousness, nonlinear temporalities, very dense wordplay, but it also remains a very one-of-a-kind novel. And Carl and Elendea Proffer, upon seeing this, immediately realized the quality of the work and set to work on publishing the novel both in Russian in 1975 as well as an English translation 2 years later that was actually done by Carl Proffer himself, who had done, in addition to running artists, did a lot of his own translations as well. And because of the translation, this novel was able to spread beyond just the Russian emigre community, but to reach an English language audience, despite its dense wordplay of the sort that sometimes gets labeled as untranslatable, and yet it is translated, and it has been very successful in that format. The next case that I want to bring attention to is not actually published by artists. This is from Indiana University Press. Is Ilya Suslov's Here's to Your Health, Komad Shifrin. And if Sokolov was an example of a really incredible success story of translation, Suslov is maybe something more of a typical narrative, if there is such thing as a typical narrative. Suslov was a Russian-Jewish humorist and editor in the Soviet Union at Literaturная Gazeta, but ultimately emigrated to the US as part of the third wave of emigration. And in the US, he was still very deeply involved with the emigre community. He had lots of contacts with other authors and continued to publish his own articles and books. But Here's to Your Health, Komad Shifrin is the only work of his that made it over into English translation. It did not end up selling incredibly, and as a result, I think it's the kind of title that runs the risk of being somewhat lost in the endless churn of the publishing industry, and I think that would be a loss. This is a novel that I really like. It is a humorous exploration of Soviet life through the lens of a young Jewish man growing up in the late Stalinist and post-Stalinist period, much in the vein of Zoshenka or Ilfin Petrov. And I think it is a wonderful snapshot of this particular time and place that is both a funny comedy as well as a very serious one at the same time. Then the next piece that I wanted to draw attention to is Vasily Aksionov's surplused barrelware, Zatovaranaya Batachkara in Russian. And so Aksionov had a very close and friendly relationship with the proffers and artists. As a writer in the Soviet Union, he was already a wildly popular author of what was called youth prose, which tended to feature younger protagonists, a lot of slang, and a relative lack of pronounced socialist ideology. But as his work started getting more formally experimental and politically contentious, eventually he was forced into exile. And artists ended up publishing a lot of these works that otherwise could not have been published in the Soviet Union, both in Russian and in translation. And in turn, Aksionov served as a kind of connector between artists and the community of Russian writers. He, I know, for instance, had gotten Andrei Bitov in touch with artists. Bitov was another Russian writer of the same time who ended up publishing probably his most famous novel, Pushkin House, Pushkinsky Dom, through artists as well. So there's this whole network of word of mouth, really, that made a lot of this possible. And I chose surplus barrelware in particular for personal reasons. This was my first introduction to Aksionov as an undergraduate, and I was kind of blown away by the sort of surrealist plot about a cast of characters falling in love with empty barrels, mixed in with sort of quasi-allegorical dream visions, for me, it was one of those moments of like, wow, I didn't know books could do this. And so that ended up being the topic of my undergraduate thesis, and indirectly ended up leading me to my research interests and dissertation now. So it's a book that is very close to my heart. And finally, in the limited time remaining, I'll just quickly mention one other text that I think is very important in the history of artists, and that is the Metropole Almanac that we unfortunately do not have pictures of here at the moment. But Metropole was a collection of literature, poetry, and illustrations that was put together collectively and independently by a group of Russian authors, including Aksionov, Iskander, as well as Viktor Yerofeev, Vladimir Vysotsky, and others, that they had all put together their work and submitted it for publication in the Soviet Union under the condition that it not be censored. And the Soviet Union took this as an affront and forced many of these authors out of many of them out of the Union of Writers and forced Aksionov out of the country entirely. Artists ended up publishing this. And they unfortunately did not escape the aftermath of its publication either. Both Karl and Elendea Profer had their visas, their Russian visas rejected just weeks after the publication of Metropole. And there was no illusion that this was just a coincidence. And they were never actually able to return to the Soviet Union after that point. So while Artists as a publisher was very proud of its tradition of not being a tool in the ideological war between West and East, they didn't take money from the CIA, they didn't publish, propaganda one way or the other, but given the cultural politics of the time, sometimes politics is going to inevitably crash onto the scene despite one's best intentions.
So we are, we're just a couple of minutes past time, which is rather impressive because that never happens. We're usually quite a bit past time. I do want to take a few minutes for questions from either the audience or the Zoom audience. If you're on Zoom, you can insert a question either, preferably in the Q&A. If you can't reach the Q&A, the chat function works as well. And I'm actually going to read a question that came in from Russell Scott Valentino, who will be speaking, and and Samantha's literally holding one of his translations in her hand. He says, he thanks you actually, Samantha, for discussing Slavica, because Professor Valentino is the director of Slavica currently. He'll talk more about it this afternoon, he says, but he has been thinking about the construction and dissemination of knowledge in general and about the construction of the Slavic field, and wanted to ask, or wanted to note the important contributions, not just of people like Michael Henry Heim, who we've mentioned, but he mentioned Susan Harris. So we should, it's important to mention editors as well. We've mentioned the Profers, but Susan Harris was the editorial director of Northwestern University Press during Writings from an Unbound Europe, and she was the editor-in-chief at Northwestern. And later, more recently, it would be familiar to those of us who read or work with Words Without Borders. She's the editorial director of that online publication for literature and translation. So I want to thank Russell for bringing that up. Oh, and Russell also now tells me, no, it's George Fowler as the Slavica director. He's the chair of the Russell's the chair of the editorial board. So thank you. I apologize for that confusion. Does anyone have a question from the audience that they would like to? Yes, please.
I also just want to say, it's not in the presentation, but Russell Valentino, who I've not met, he's on Zoom somewhere, has his own press based in Iowa. He's at Indiana, Autumn Hill Books, and they're publishing some really interesting stuff, not just in Serbo-Croatian, but the Serbo-Croatian entries are very interesting, translated by Celia Hawksworth himself and Tomislav Kuzmanovic. So just want to plug those.
Test.
Thank you. I just have a really brief question for Sam. I saw on your first slide Deep Vellum listed, and I just missed the connection between Northwestern and Deep Vellum, or the presses you're talking about, because they are now publishing a lot of literature and translation, especially Ukrainian literature translation. So I'd like to hear more about that connection.
Yeah, so I'm from Texas, so I'm very fond of Deep Vellum. They're based in Dallas. Their main publisher is Will Evans. And they were connected to Dalkey, actually, because so the founder of Dalkey Archive Press, John O'Brien, passed away, and Will Evans and Deep Vellum purchased the back catalog of Dalkey. So they're now in charge of figuring out what to reprint from Dalkey Archive Press and kind of rearranging the chaos and of the business strategy of Dalkey, which, despite the chaos, kept a lot of unsellable books in print. So that was the connection. So yeah, everything's kind of shifting, maybe towards Dallas and the rise of Deep Vellum, but.
Just a footnote, I wanted to say that, since I don't know if we mentioned it, because we keep talking about Dalkey Archive Press keeps coming up, it is also a Midwestern press. It was institutionally housed for many years at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, and then it's still in operation, but it has spun off these other presses, Open Letter at the University of Rochester and Deep Vellum, which is based in Dallas. Are there any other?
I had a question, actually. Maybe for Dylan or others who know, but you mentioned, you were talking about the artists' press and that they didn't take funding from the CIA and they tried not to get involved in politics. And I don't know if you or others could talk about how this press got started for those of us who aren't familiar with it, and also if they didn't get funding from those places, how did they, sorry to put you on the spot, but like how did they manage production?
So I actually, that is a very interesting question. I have not really looked into artists' financial backing. So there's not a whole lot of information I can give on that account. But I believe, and someone can correct me if I am mistaken on this, that they did get some support through the university, which was able to fund many of these productions, as well as it being a very a popular publishing house. They were able to make profits on a number of their translations, which is, with translated literature, as we've already seen, something of a rarity. Ajar, I don't know if you have anything else to add here?
I also saw a lot of affiliation with the Slavic department at the University of Michigan, obviously, and how even bringing particular writers, poets, was specifically just knowing who to talk to, and then organizing the trips through the Slavic department.
I think that in the interest of time, we'll probably, is that okay? If we stop now, because it is now 12 noon, and the next panel is supposed to begin, we'll begin the next panel. We're going to take about a 5 to 10 minute break, actually, if that's all right with everyone. And then we will tune in again at 12, let's say 12:10, for the next meeting, which is on Tamizdat and the Cold War. And for this, we have two out-of-town guests who will be joining us over Zoom. Yasha Klots from New York and Jesse Lebov from Budapest. So please come back in about 10 minutes and we will resume. Thank you very much.